CloudDB, shaping your new normal.
Welcome everyone to the 2021 APAC Groundbreakers Virtual Tour by Apaco UC. This year our event will be the biggest one ever done with 144 sessions, including normal sessions, workshops, and hands-on labs from 100 different speakers over 17 days. Also, it will cover sessions in 4 different languages. Please remember to register to as many sessions as you can. This way, you're going to have access to the replays of the sessions. They will be available through the platform until December 30, 2021. I would like to say thanks to our Oracle user groups and Java user groups that made this event possible, and also to your main sponsors, Oracle Groundbreakers, and your main sponsor, CloudDB. Now, for today's session, what's new in Oracle Data Pump, 21C, 19C, and early releases by Roy Swonger. Please feel free to post questions at any time by using the chat window of live webinar on the right lower corner of your screen. If you have any technical issues, please feel free to ask at any moment, and I will try to help you the best I can to solve them. And today's topics is a very interesting one. I recommend you guys to take a look. Roy is a fantastic speaker, and Data Pump is something that I love too. I wrote a book, the first book about backup and recovery that came out when 12C came out, Backup and Recovery Survivor Guide, a little bit of advertising over there. And Data Pump was one of the key points of my book. Saying that, without any further ado, Roy, thank you so much. And I leave you everyone with this fantastic session by Roy.
Thank you. Thank you, Francisco. Nihao, ohayou gozaimasu. Good day to everybody who's attending here. I really appreciate you being online for this talk. My name is Roy Swonger. I'm Vice President for Database Upgrade, Patching, and Utilities at Oracle. And this talk is going to be all about the new features in Data Pump. Now, what we have done with this talk is we've structured it to go backwards in time. So we're going to start with the new features of 21C, and then we'll go back to the new features in 19, 18, and as many 12.2 new features as we can get to. But I guarantee I will not get to everything in this talk, but it's all there in the slides when you want to download it later. The reason we put all of these releases in our new features talk is simply that many of our customers are upgrading from releases like 11.204, 12.102, maybe performing cross-platform migrations as part of that. And that means that you'll be uptaking the new features from 12.2, 18, and 19 all along the way. And I don't really expect you to be using 21 at this point. 21 is what we call an innovation release. It's really there for those who want to pick up new features that are not really generally available in 19, and maybe you want to play with it, develop with it, but just be aware that 21C only has about 2.5 years total support lifespan. 23C will be the next long-term release. So with that said, let's dive right in. So you see the kind of headline for what is Data Pump. And if you haven't used Data Pump, well, you're among the very few who hasn't used it. It's one of the most popular utilities for Oracle Database because it's it's almost like what you'd call a Swiss Army knife. It can do anything when you're migrating data from one database to another. You can change platforms, you can change partitioning, compression, character sets, versions, time zones, you name it. Data Pump can handle it. And that's why it's been around for 20 years now. So let's start at the top, and we're going to start with the 21C features. As I mentioned, these are ones that you may not really use for a few years yet, but it's nice to know what's coming as well as what you're going to experience when you go to 19C. So here you see a list of the features, and they are very much cloud-focused. Now remember, 21C is a relatively small release, so we don't have a lot of features here, but I'll go through these pretty quickly. The first feature that is new to 21 is that we can export from our cloud platforms, like Autonomous Database, into an object store. With 19C, we could import from an object store into our cloud platforms, but with 21 we can export as well, and that's a pretty significant change. If you don't know what object stores are, they are kind of an unbounded storage of objects in the cloud. And they're not really like traditional file systems. So we had to do some extra work to be able to export to them, to import from them, because they don't support things really easily, such as random writes, for example, are something that object stores aren't good at. But we've got that in 21C, and that means once you get to 23 in a few years, that'll be waiting for you there. So in order to do this with an object store, one of the things that you need when you interact with an object store is a cloud credential. So what you will do in that case to use a credential with Data Pump is you first use the DBMS Cloud create credential procedure. You load that into your database. And then once you do that, you can specify the credential as part of your Data Pump command. And then your file location looks very different. Your file location for a dump file will actually be what's called a URI, a Uniform Resource Identifier, as opposed to a URL, a Uniform Resource Locator. So it's a cloud location for your file. And that's why it looks very different from a regular dump file spec. So once you know about all that, the credential parameter requires a URI as a dump file. You don't mix and match object store and file system locations. So if you're using a directory object and a file system in ASM, that's one way to do it. The other way is credentials and object store. You can't mix them. The default directory parameter is where your log files are going to go in the cloud, because we don't write the log files yet out to object store. And then the log file parameter, as always, you can specify a directory object as part of the log file parameter. Now, I mentioned that we can also import into ADB. Now, we added this back in 19C. So for Autonomous Database, ADW is Autonomous Data Warehouse, ATP is Autonomous Transaction Processing. We can import from Object Store into those platforms. Now, the directory object there is only for your log files. The dump files in this case are those URIs that we talked about. So you have credentials, you have URIs, and then you have some other parameters that you might want to specify, such as if you're importing an encrypted dump file, you might have to prompt for the password. You might want to exclude certain types of things, like in Autonomous Database, we often recommend that you not bring over your indexes and partitions. You're able to, but you might want to exclude those. And when you're going into the dedicated infrastructure, we currently recommend that you specify no log file and instead capture the output from your screen. That way you don't fill up your dedicated infrastructure disk space that you're paying for with log files, for example. So here's a little demo of exporting to the object store. It's not going to look much different from what you just saw, but it just kind of shows you that, yes, it's operational. So we're going to create a user in the database to perform the export, create the object store credential with the DBMS credential package in the earlier releases. Now it would be DBMS cloud.create credential. And then you simply export as you would for a normal data pump export, and it will go along just as you would expect. So the idea is to make the experience as similar as possible to working with a file system. Simple as that. Now in ATP, just as an aside, if you don't want to go through the object store, you can import into ATP on dedicated infrastructure directly over a DB link. And this is coming very, very soon to shared infrastructure as well. But that's another convenient way to get into Autonomous. It's not really a new feature, except that 19C was the first version that was in Autonomous Database. So using network mode with Data Pump is another way to migrate to those platforms. And I'm actually going to skip this demonstration. Now, one of the more important but very small features that we added in 21C is checksumming of data files. Now, you could always do this yourself, of course. You could export to your dump files, run an MD5 checksum over them, keep track of that, and upload it to the cloud. But now, especially when you can export directly to the cloud object store, it's helpful to have that checksum built in to Data Pump. So we've added the ability to create a checksum to verify a checksum for export and import of data pump. You can see the way it's done here. You can specify a checksum algorithm if you really want to, although the default algorithm is perfectly acceptable for pretty much everybody. But if you have one in mind that is your favorite checksum algorithm for some reason, go ahead and do that. And then on import, you would say verify checksum. Now, by default, we will verify a checksum if it is there. So when we're performing an import with data pump, if we find that there's a checksum associated with your dump files, we will verify it. So really you would use verify checksum equals no to prevent that. For example, you could first get the dump files where they need to be and then run data pump with IMPDP and set checksum as verify only equals yes. So that way you verify the dump files first, and then when you want to go import them, you don't have to take the time to do the checksum verification, because verifying a checksum on a really large set of dump files can take several minutes. So you might want to do that as soon as you've got them where you want to place them. Another thing that we added in 21, which will be very important for the long term, and it's something we've been asked about for well over a decade, is the ability to combine include and exclude into the same data pump job. We didn't used to be able to do that. In order to get the effect of combining include and exclude, you had to use your export with an include parameter. So that would specify the set of objects that you wanted to export. And then on import, you could use the exclude parameter to eliminate some things from your dump files that you didn't want to import into the database. Now, you might be wondering why you would want to do that. And it's because it's the same semantics when you include them in the same command now. We do the include first, and then we do the exclude. So let me give you an example of why you might want to do that. Here's an example. If you say export with include equals table, you don't just get your tables or your table data. You get the table definition, you do get the table data, but you also get all the dependent objects on the table, the comments, the triggers, the constraints, the statistics, and so on. And you might not want all of that when you import, especially into Autonomous, for example, but there may be other places where you don't want to bring your statistics along. Let's say you're moving to Exadata, for example, and you're going to move into hybrid columnar compression, and maybe you want to have Exadata specific statistics on the table after you import. So there's no reason to bring the statistics as part of the import. Well, now you could add exclude equals statistics, and we won't bother exporting your table statistics, your index statistics associated with that table. So it lets you be more precise about your data pump jobs. Finally, another database 21C feature is that we give you control over the index compression clause. We've given you control in the past over table compression, starting with, I believe it was 11.1 when we implemented the advanced compression option. You are able to set the table compression clause on import. So if you've got, say, an uncompressed database in 11.204, you're migrating into Exadata, you could say compress for query high. In other places, you could compress for OLTP. Whatever you want to do, you can specify that as part of your import, and it will do that for every table in that import. Well, now you can also specify the type of index compression that you want to use. That kind of rounds out the compression functionality of data pump. Oh, and another one that's very cloud-oriented, although you might find it useful yourself on premises or other locations, is to remap multiple table spaces with a wildcard. Now, the reason I say this is cloud-oriented is that in our autonomous on shared infrastructure environment, when you have a database there, you get one table space for users. It's called data. So you get one and only one data table space. So when you import, instead of trying to create a bunch of table spaces, which you're not allowed to do, what you can do is say remap underscore table space % to data. And it'll remap every table space in your source database so that all of your tables, your indexes, all of that goes into the data table space, and it will do that automatically with just the one parameter. That way you don't have to know what are the table spaces in this particular database that have to get remapped. kind of related to that is the tablespace transform parameter. So if you say transform equals tablespace no, then what we would do is we would, so just to recap, you can now use a wildcard with Remap Tablespace to remap multiple tablespaces to one tablespace. That's very useful in autonomous database. We can say transform equals tablespace no to put all of the import into the importing user's default tablespace. That can be very useful for making sure that people go only where they're supposed to when they're importing. And then we can talk about transportable tablespaces. 21C transportable tablespaces, we allow you to export and import metadata in parallel. That's going to be very important for databases like eBusiness Suite, like SAP databases where you have tens of thousands of metadata objects of each type, your views, your indexes, your tables, and so on. We'll be able to, for transportable tablespace jobs, move the metadata in parallel, and that'll be much better, much faster. And we've also made transportable tablespace jobs restartable in 21C. So that means that if your transportable tablespace export, for example, gets interrupted for some reason, you can restart it, which is really important because when you're doing a transportable tablespace export, you have to have your tablespaces read-only. And often people see that as being, that's an outage for your production system. So you wouldn't want to have to start all the way over at the beginning and have that outage be longer. So this restartability for transportable jobs is just really nice starting in 21. Just as an aside, some SQL Loader new features in 21C. Main one is that 21C introduces the new binary JSON data type in Oracle Database. Yes, we had JSON support in 19C, for example, maybe even in 18, but that was kind of JSON as implemented in CLOBs. In 21C, we have the new binary JSON data type, which is faster, more performant, and it allows us to load data faster and use direct path, conventional path, all the usual ways of accessing data for SQL Loader as a native data type. And just like Data Pump, SQL Loader can load from object stores. You can load from the Cloud Object Store. It's a little different from doing it with Data Pump because SQL Loader does all its processing on the client, whereas Data Pump is doing most of its processing on the server. So where with Data Pump, you added credentials to the database to use them. With SQL Loader, you create them in the client wallet, and then you specify the input file using one of those object store URIs as the in file, and you specify the credential on the SQL Loader command line. So SQL Loader can do object store in 21C. Okay, so that's the 21C new features kind of very quickly. Now let's talk about the version you're most likely to use, which is 19C. And we've got a lot of new features in Data Pump in 19C. Suppressing encrypted columns clause, limits on parallelism if you want to set them, some security features about authenticated roles and using object store credentials, wildcards in the object store dump file names, transportable tablespace test mode, which you might be interested in, and another transportable tablespace feature, read-only tablespaces. So let's go through those really quick. With encrypted columns, the biggest problem with encrypted columns, which is kind of the original encryption that was added back, I think it was in 10.2, was when we added encrypted columns to the database. But then we quickly realized, and I think everybody realized, that encrypted columns are and really what you want is encrypted tablespaces. But you can't put an encrypted column in an encrypted tablespace. So what this does is it makes it easier for you to move to TDE and encrypted tablespaces, even if you had encrypted columns in your original database. Because what you can do is just give us this transform omit encryption clause, and then when we create the table in your target database, we won't put that encrypted column clause in there, so you can put it into an encrypted tablespace. So it kind of takes a couple of extra steps out of converting from encrypted columns to encrypted tablespaces. This feature of setting max data pump jobs and parallelism was added primarily for massively multi-tenant environments, because if you have a container database where you have, say, 250 PDBs in it, well, if you had everybody in that, every PDB owner decided to do a data pump export with, say, parallel 32, well, 32 times 250 PDBs, that's a lot of processes. And it may exceed your process count. And in fact, between the number of jobs in a database and the parallelism you could put there, you could have someone who would kind of do a denial of service on your database by using up all of your processes, by just spawning lots and lots of data pump jobs in high degrees of parallel. So if you are in a situation where you want to control that, we give you the ability to do so. You can set the maximum number of data pump jobs that can run at any given time in a database, and you can also set the maximum parallelism for each data pump job. So if you don't want anybody to use more than parallel 32, you can set that. You could leave it at the default of 50. You could make the range as high as 250 if you want to. This is just a very small security feature to be aware of. And that's if you have secure roles in your database when you do an export. On import, we will disable those roles by default. Because what we don't want to have happen is that you could have a user who just tells you that what they've got is, can you just import this table for me, for example. And what they've done is they've stuck in an authorization for their user to have a secure role or something like that, kind of a Trojan horse in a dump file. To prevent that from happening, we don't enable secure roles by default. You have to specifically tell us to do that. And you should only do that if you know that you can 100% trust what is in a dump file. 19C was the first release where we were able to use object store credentials with data pump. Now this is only in the cloud environments, so autonomous environments for autonomous database, but it allows us to import from Oracle Cloud, but also from AWS and Azure. If you've got data that's over in those cloud environments, you can move it into Oracle database as well. So for importing into autonomous database, you would use dbmscloud.createCredential. That creates a credential within the database so that when data pump operates, which remember, it's mostly PL/SQL packages within the database, it has access to that credential, which you'd specify on your data pump command line. We added the ability to have wildcards in object store dump file names starting in 19C as well. Now, of course, that was the first release that we had object store dump files at all, but when we originally had the ability to import from an object store in autonomous database, you had to list every file individually. Later on, in a later update for autonomous database, we added the ability to use wildcards even in URI-based file locations, not just in file system file locations. So that will help if you've got a whole bunch of files for a very large database and you don't want to have to list each of them out separately. On the transportable tablespace side in 19C, the test mode is kind of interesting. So one of the issues with transportable tablespace, which I mentioned earlier, is that when you're exporting, your tablespaces have to be read-only, because we have to know that when we get that information from seg$ about what storage segments belong to which objects, that you're not changing anything in the tablespaces when we're doing that. Like you're not inserting and causing a new segment to be created and so on. So that read-only aspect means that doing an export from transportable tablespaces is basically an outage for production. And that's a real problem when you're trying to just kind of validate a migration before you do it. So you might want to say, well, this is what I think I'm going to do on the export. Does the transportable tablespace closure check succeed, for example? Or how long will it take to export the metadata? You might want to know that as well. So that's what test mode allows you to do. It allows you to perform that export saying TTS closure check equals test mode. And that means that you don't have to set your table spaces read-only for that export. And you can test the closure check. You can test how long it's going to take. So that's kind of useful. But be aware that the dump file produced by this cannot be imported anywhere. If you try, we will give you an error message saying that this was a test mode dump file not meant to be imported, because it's very likely that the metadata in that dump file is not actually consistent with what's in your table spaces. But still a useful thing when you've got a big transportable table space migration and you want to do a little validation up front. On the other side, on the import side for transportable tablespace, we've brought back the pre-12.2 behavior. What I mean by that is, before 12.2, when you did an import of with transportable tablespaces, we did not set your tablespaces read-write. You had to do that after the import. And that would allow you to have the same tablespace data files mounted on both the source and the target system, as long as both of them had those files read-only. So you set the tablespace data files read-only for the export, you do the import, everything works, you've still got the same one data file mounted in two places because it's read-only. The second you make it read-write in either place, it's no longer accessible to the other database. Well, we didn't think that that was a widely used capability, but a few customers did complain when we took it away. Now, why did we take it away? Might be your question. Well, the reason we changed this was, starting in 12.2, we added two capabilities to transportable tablespaces. One is the ability, with full transportable especially, to migrate from an older time zone version to a database that has a newer time zone version with full transportable. But in order to do that, we had to open up the tablespaces read-write and fix the time zone data before saying that the operation had completed. The other thing that we do is we will reclaim unused space, unused free space inside your table spaces. And so if you've done an export with transportable table spaces and maybe not everything that you were exporting, maybe the table spaces included some things that you weren't exporting, like a table that had a partition in your table space, but you didn't move that particular table. Well, we'll reclaim that as free space after your import. Again, in order to do that, we had to open the table space data file, read-write, and go through it and reclaim the free space. So there were good reasons that we made that behavior change, but unfortunately some customers were depending on the ability to have a table space read-only on two different systems. So we restored that ability in 19C by saying transportable equals keep read-only. Now what that will do is it will now require that you have the same identical time zone version on source and target, and we will not reclaim the free space, but you get that old behavior back. So here's just an example. You say transportable equal read-only. Okay, that was it for 19C new features. Now we're going to talk about 18C, which I will bet is a release that you haven't really used. It's not a widely used release. More people use 12.201 than 18, and that's okay, because 18C, again, like 21, it was an innovation release with a very short time span. It's already out of support. So what did we put into 18? Well, you see here some new data options, a warning about encrypted DB links, and then the unified audit trail for data pump. So very quickly here, these are pretty small features. Let's see. So for continue load on format error, what we do is, when we're loading from a dump file, there can be cases where, maybe due to a corruption in the dump file or something like that, the data stream, kind of an internal construct of data pump, if we find a format error there where a number or date, for example, is incorrect, what we'll do is we'll skip to the next granule of data and keep loading it. So this can be useful if you've got a corrupt dump file. It may be possible to get the bulk of the data out of it if it was just a very small part of the dump file that somehow got corrupted. We'll also, when you're importing, we'll tell you if you need to reset passwords. And this can happen if you have a database link and you have an encrypted link. What we do is we don't put those encrypted passwords into the database. We set them to a known bad password and tell you that you have to update the password in order to use that DB link again. This is, again, it's a security issue where we don't want somebody to be able to import a DB link that is somehow pointing to a remote database and giving themselves access to something that they shouldn't. And then finally for 18C, we add the ability to use the unified audit trail to audit data pump operations. So unified auditing was added back in, 12.102. Wasn't very useful then, it had some performance issues. It's gotten better now in, say, 19, it's usable. But actually, I probably wouldn't recommend using unified auditing before 19 based on the various issues they worked through and the performance improvements that they made. Okay, we've got a little bit of time left. Let's see how far we can get to 12.2 through 12.2. Now, 12.2 was a very big release for Data Pump. And the biggest feature on this list is the parallel export and import of metadata. Now, I talked about this in the Data Pump internals talk, so I'm going to talk about it very lightly here. If you want to see a deeper discussion of how parallel metadata export and import works, go to the Data Pump internals talk from last week, and you'll get much deeper treatment of it. But suffice it to say that before 12.2, we imported and exported most metadata serially, with the exception of package bodies. Starting in 12.2, we import and export metadata in parallel. The nice thing about that is, even if you're exporting from, say, 11.204, where it's all serial, you can get parallel import from those same dump files. It doesn't have to have been exported in parallel to be imported in parallel. So what we will do there is, for the export, it has to be 12.2 or higher. We start with the estimate phase. The metadata objects get collected first, and we export those as parallel as possible. Some of them, like types, we have to do serially. And then we can either use one partition, one worker per partition. Well, this is about data, actually, so I'll skip that part. And then what you would see the difference in 12.1 versus, say, 12.2, whereas on the left side with 12.102, you'll see one worker start up at the beginning, export a bunch of metadata, and then it's only once we can start on the data that the other workers start up. In 12.201, we start up all of the parallel workers at once. We figure out how many are needed to export the metadata, and we start getting the metadata out as quickly as possible. Same thing's true on import. Before 12.2 with import, it was serial. Starting with 12.2, we import most metadata in parallel. The ones that we don't do in parallel, it's due to dependency ordering, like types because of type inheritance, schemas because of schema, cross-schema references, and procedural actions are always ordered by the various components that create procedural actions. So in this case, metadata is sitting for import, for example, the metadata will be in your dump file as XML documents, each of which has a certain number of elements in it. For example, for users, you might have 80 create user statements per document. So in this case, with 161 users, worker 1 and worker 2 would each get 80 users to import. Worker 3 would get 1, and the rest of the workers would be idle while we're importing users. Still, it gives you very good parallelism. Especially if you have a lot of metadata, you're going to see very good scalability of parallel metadata. In this case, you can see that going parallel 8 makes it 5 times as fast for this particular part of what are we looking at, object grams. And we have some data in the presentation about what we measured in an eBusiness Suite database. I'm not going to go through this because, as I mentioned, I did that in the internals talk as well. So some other nice features in 12.2. Substitution variables for dump file names. We added a lot of different variables that you can put in a dump file name. We've always had %u to do a substitution of numbers 1 to 99, so you can have a wildcard and create multiple dump files with up to 99 of each name. Now, one of the things we found when we got to 12.2, we're now getting databases being moved around that are tens of terabytes. And if you have, say, 40 terabytes and you want to have your dump files only be, say, 5 gig, well, you might have more than 100 dump files. So we added the %L substitution so that you can have a virtually unlimited number of dump files with that same prefix. It will be over 2 billion, as you can see there, dump files, or up to 2.1 billion with %L compared to 99 with %U. But we also added some other substitution variables, so we can do things like a timestamp or a date stamp as part of the dump file name. And that can be really useful if you've got tooling that creates dump files regularly and you want to give them unique names so that you can stuff them away, archive them based on the date, locate them based on the date later, and so on. We also added the ability to have wildcards in your transportable tablespace data files parameter. So before 12.2, if you were doing a transportable tablespace import, you had to list out every individual data file that was going to be imported as part of that job. And a lot of databases have hundreds and hundreds of data files. That can make for a very large parameter file, let alone making it impossible to put it all on one command line. Well, with 12.2, we can put wildcards in there, and that is really useful because you can just give us a directory location, or in this case, you see here, user star.dbf or question.dbf, and that can substitute for a whole bunch of data files. The star is unbounded, so kind of substitution variable syntax there. The question mark will be one and only one character. We added the ability to remap directories as well. Now, this, I want to be specific here. This is about remapping a file system directory, not a directory object. So what we're doing here is when you're moving from one system to another, and especially when you're going from one operating system to another, what you might find is that the location of your file names for tablespaces, for example, the tablespace specification may change significantly, whether it's because you're going from Windows to Linux, so the direction of your slashes changes, or you had brackets, or whatever it was, based on the source and target operating system. Well, now what you can do is you can just change the directory spec for all of your create tablespaces, and that will say whatever it was on the source, you can now put it into a new directory that actually exists on the target. Very useful for going cross-platform. 12.201, if you may remember, is when we introduced long identifiers to Oracle Database. That means that your tables, schemas, column names, a few other things can now be 128 bytes long instead of being limited to 30 bytes. This was done not just for kind of competitive parity with other things like Sybase that had 128 byte identifiers for a long time, but also because we wanted people to move to Unicode. And AL32 UTF-8 is a variable length encoding where a single character can be up to 4 bytes long. So if you're going to Unicode and we're limited to 30 bytes, that means depending on your source character set that you might be converting from, you might be limited to as few as 7 characters in a name, and that gets very difficult to give things meaningful and unique names. With 128 bytes, of course, it's a lot easier. So Datapump does fully support that starting in 12.2. Just do be aware, if you have a need to export from 12.2 or later and then import into an earlier release like 11.204 or 12.102, don't use those long identifiers, because if you say export version equals 11.2, then we will skip any table that has a column with more than 30 bytes in the name, or a table name of more than 30 bytes, and so on. So you do still have to be aware of that if you're going back to older releases. This was a very important performance feature that we added in 12.2, trust existing table partitions. This is specifically there for when you are importing into an already existing partitioned table, such as doing a table exist action equals append or truncate onto an existing table. The reason it's important is if data pump has not done the table creation as part of the import, then we can't be sure that the partitioning scheme on the source will match that of the target. And if we're not sure, then we have to go serially, which means one and only one worker working at a time on that table. Because otherwise, if you tried to load a table that was partitioned with parallel 30 and you're loading parallel 32, what would happen is the worker that's active would take out a table lock. The other 31 workers are going to sit there idle. Well, if you know, as a DBA performing an import, if you're 100% certain that the partitioning scheme on the source matches the target, but you're just importing for whatever reason into an already existing table, if you tell us to trust the existing table partitions, you're holding your hand up saying, I swear that this is going to work, and then we'll go full parallel and you'll get a lot better performance. If they don't match, you'll get the error message that you see there, and we won't load that table. I'm just going to do just 1 minute more. That'll take us to 10 of, because we did get a little disruption due to disconnects, and hopefully we'll get almost to the end here. We added a couple of things to deal with validating data for conditions that should never happen. So you should not have to use this normally, but for debugging purposes or for dealing with weird cases where maybe you get a corrupt data file or an old dump file that was exported when there was a bug active or something, we added the ability to validate table data on import, that's date and number formats, and also on export to do an extra validation pass or verification pass over the data stream when we're writing it out. The only time I would use the verify stream format upon writing is if you're going to be exporting and you know that you're going to keep that dump file around for a long time and may not be able to reproduce it later, because there will be overhead to doing either of these verification steps. So especially for the export side, if you're doing it for sort of archival purposes, then go ahead and do verify stream format, but otherwise you shouldn't need to. And we'll give you some examples here about what can happen if there's some weird thing that goes wrong and we get a stream verification error. We had to actually inject that into our example. We couldn't produce it just kind of on the fly. A couple of other things, just quick tech tips. We added the ability to use direct path load over a network link. That's really useful if you've got long raw data that you want to move data pump over a network link. You can say access method equals direct path if the source database is 12.2 or higher. We've added data pump to the instant client since 12.2. Now it's in the tools package. So don't just get the instant client, make sure you get the tools package as well, and that will get you data pump and SQL loader. So that's useful. Some views that you can use to describe transforms and some more interactive commands. Probably the most important one being that you can change tracing on a data pump job in the middle of the job. That's something I also talked about during data pump internals when we talked about tracing. So if that's of interest to you, go grab the data pump internals talk that Francisco will surely have available for you on the Groundbreakers website. And made it. Okay, despite disconnects, made it to the end. I did want to mention, I'll leave this up as the last slide for a little bit, then we'll do Q&A. We have a really comprehensive set of upgrade and migration webinars. We're still building on this, by the way. We currently have 11 webinars that range anywhere from 1.5 to 2 hours each. The one we are doing next week is going to be on migration of very large databases. By that we mean 100 terabytes or larger. What can you do to migrate those as quickly and easily as possible? And then the one after that, we're going to kind of skip January due to the holidays and February. And then in March, we've got a deep dive into data pump, which is really going to kind of aggregate the 3 talks that I'm doing here at the Groundbreakers tour, which is our new features, our deep dive, and our lesser known features. But you can get these webinars all off Mike Dietrich or Daniel Overby Hansen's blog. They're all free, available on demand, and the links there don't require you to even register or anything like that. So have at it and enjoy all the different topics that we have available. So with that, let's see if there are any questions that have come through in the chat. And again, apologies for the disconnects. I'm not seeing any questions yet, but if anyone has questions about new features, happy to answer them.
Hi, Roy. Excellent session as always. Apologies for all the technical issues that happened, but that was fantastic. I cannot see any questions coming at the moment from the system.
I'm only seeing 3 participants.
But I know the people love to do the questions afterwards. That means if you're watching the replay or you have any questions that you want to do offline directly to Roy, you can do through his email, or you can also connect with him to his Twitter handle too. And I'm sure that Roy will be more than happy to answer the questions offline. And thank you, Roy, for taking all the time for you. I know it's late for you in the day, and sharing all this knowledge in these interesting topics with our community in the Asia Pac and globally.
Well, thank you, Francisco, and thank you to CloudDB for sponsoring. We really appreciate it.
No, thanks. And have a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, depending on everyone are around the world. And please take care and be safe. Thank you, Roy. Bye-bye.
CloudDB, shaping your new normal.